The movie kicks off in 1960, introducing us to young George Foreman, an overweight kid who has just moved to Houston, Texas, with his mom, two sisters, and a brother. Their money situation is a mess, and their new house gives a new meaning to the word new, a complete wreckage that even lacks basics like electricity. On their first night, George's mom, Nancy, cuts a burger into 4 pieces so she can feed them, and yet she insists on saying grace before eating, something George clearly is not into. Before bedtime, George's mom advises him to avoid fights at his new school. As George narrates in the background, he was dealing with anger issues, and fighting was the only thing he was good at. He promises his mom not to fight, but things don't go as he expects the next day. George is the biggest kid in his class, and he really wants to read out loud. However, the teacher notices his torn clothes and decides to choose another student who's dressed nicely. During lunch break, Foreman is the only one not eating. Suddenly, one of his classmates starts being mean, throwing a piece of skin on the ground for George and calling him poor man. Everyone bursts into laughter, which pushes George over the edge, and he ends up giving the boy a solid punch in the face. The laughter quickly fades into silence, and George realizes that he broke the promise he made to his mom. All of this leads him to drop out of school. The movie takes us to George's 19th year, where he's turned to mugging in order to survive. Alongside one of his buddies, they pick a target, only to discover he's actually an undercover cop who has set them up. George panics and starts running, eventually finding refuge under a house where sewage is dumped. If you're a bit squeamish, it's probably best to skip ahead 20 seconds and smash that like button, you know, just for no reason. The police use a dog to search for him, forcing George to cover himself with human waste. This way, he manages to throw off the dog's sniffer and get away clean. Well, maybe not so clean, but you get the idea. On his way back, he sees this TV ad that's like a one-time opportunity, Job Corps, where young, uneducated guys like him get trained for jobs. Free food, free healthcare, and a bit of cash each month. What more could he ask for? George tells his mom all about it, and she's on board, but only on one condition. This time, George can't quit what he started and gotta stick with it till the end. He heads to Job Corps in Pleasanton, California, where he's given strict rules. No alcohol, no smoking, no women, and no fighting. Upon arriving at the dorm, he's pleasantly surprised to find a new pair of sneakers from his mother, instantly falling in love with them. Determined to make up for his school day's lack of focus, he hits the books harder than ever, aiming to soak up new knowledge. One day, he gets into an argument with this troublemaker named Desmond, who disrupts his studying with music. Despite George's anger, Desmond stays chill, and their bond actually gets better. Turns out, Desmond is a rule breaker, drinking in the dorm like it's no big deal. George later finds out his shoes got stolen, and it totally ticks him off. In the dining hall, Desmond brags about his brilliant money-saving idea for the Job Corp, which led to them having brownies instead of beans, showcasing his money management skills. While they are bonding, George suddenly notices his shoes on someone else's feet. Fuming with rage, he follows the guy back to his room and forcefully punches through the door. The thief finds himself hanging upside down from the window. Just then, Doc shows up, saves the thief, and scolds George for what he did. Outside, he checks George's record and realizes he's beaten up 3 other courtmen in addition to that innocent door. Doc wants to know where all the rage is coming from, but George denies, saying,
"I don't have any rage."
Sure, just like a 2,000-pound rodeo bull wouldn't have any after getting a hit in the sensitive spot. Doc wants to fire him from the Job Corps, but has a change of heart when he sees him plead. Turns out he's a boxing coach, and the plan shifts to teaching George the ropes too. Doc soon challenges George to a match to see what he's made of. George relies on his street style and taps into his rage, but it proves ineffective against his fast and skilled opponent. Meanwhile, in the crowd, Desmond cheers for George while secretly selling illegal items. Ultimately, George hits the canvas after taking a few punches. Storming out, he vents his frustration by delivering one furious punch that sends the punching bag flying off its hanger. George is mad at Doc because the crowd laughed at him. But Doc, who has seen a punch he has never seen before, convinces George not to care about others. In addition to physical training, Doc spots George's main weak spot, his mind. He shows him how to dodge mind games and use his rage to win. By learning the techniques and exercises, George surprisingly picks up the boxer vibe real quick. After some time, he once again finds himself facing the same guy who beat him before. This time, George completely shuts down all his opponent's options, not giving him a single chance and effortlessly knocking him out. Soon after, George tells Doc about his desire to become the world heavyweight champion, inspired by Joe Frazier's fancy lifestyle that he came across in a magazine. Doc chuckles and explains that George should start by winning a few amateur tournaments. He clarifies that there's no way George can prepare for the upcoming year's Olympics, but George's face shows nothing but determination and a burning passion for boxing. A year later, in the finals of the 1968 Mexico Olympics, Foreman faces the Russian Jonas Cepelis with 203 wins and does the impossible. At first, the Russian dominates, raining punches on George. Yet 19-year-old Foreman manages to turn the tables and shock everyone by beating Cepelis, becoming the Olympic champ. He celebrates his victory by waving the American flag, which is later scolded by his homies. They think George missed a chance to stand up for black rights, pointing out two black athletes who raised their fists in a gesture of black power during the podium. After sharing his decision to pursue boxing with his mother, George heads to Oakland, California to continue his training. At Oakland Airport, George bumps into a local cutie named Paula, and they end up swapping digits. When George arrives at the boxing training center in Oakland, Doc introduces him to his trainers, Dick Sadler and Archie Moore. They're going to prepare him to be the heavyweight champ. Before the training, Archie lets George know his final rival will be Joe Frazier, giving him a little preview to fire him up for the big day. George begins to train professionally, focusing on making his punches stronger and stronger. In addition, his coaches give him tips on Joe Frazier's weak spots. George hits the pro scene and starts knocking out opponents left and right. Meanwhile, things get real between him and Paula, and they decide to get married. George's winning streak goes on for 36 fights straight, but then it's showdown time in 73. He steps into the ring with Joe Frazier, aiming for that heavyweight title. Joe starts off strong, firing up the crowd with a couple of deadly left hooks. But then George unleashes his inner beast and sends Joe crashing to the canvas with his killer punches. To everyone's surprise, Foreman wins the championship title that Joe had held for a long time. At the victory party, George meets up with Desmond, who's proud to see George become a successful boxer. George straight up asks Desmond to handle his money and be his right-hand man, but wants him to be sharp from now on. It means no more drinking. Desmond gets the message, pours out his drink, and happily agrees to the deal. George walks into his hotel room and sees this party girl giving him the eye. It seems that being married doesn't stop George from hooking up. Later on a TV show, he sees Muhammad Ali mocking him and calling him out for a fight. And George's blood starts boiling like crazy. At George's daughter's birthday party, he gets everyone together at his fancy house. Nancy's still holding on to her religious vibe, wanting to say grace before the meal, but George finds it ridiculous. While they're eating, Mary announces that she's pregnant, and Desmond tells George that he invested his money in some solid stocks. The phone rings, and Paula goes to pick it up. It's those girls George has been messing around with. Paula let her husband know that she's on to his affairs. As it turns out, they're stuck in a dead-end relationship, with George showing no concern for their marriage. A year later, in 1974, George Foreman and Ali faces each other for the heavyweight championship in a $5 million match. Before the big bout, Ali mocks George's boxing style in front of the press. He's trying to get into George's head with all his trash talk, but George just responds with a confident look. On fight night, despite the crowd cheering for Ali, the commentator sees him as the underdog. George is dead set on winning and keeps pounding Ali round after round, not letting up. However, Ali uses a clever technique, the rope-a-dope. He stays close to the ropes, defending against George's punches. By the 5th round, George starts to get tired, and by the 8th, he's exhausted and losing hope. That's the moment Ali has been counting on. Out of nowhere, he strikes back and knocks George down with a series of deadly blows, making him the heavyweight champion. George is in disbelief after losing his first match following a streak of 40 wins. He's now divorcing Paula and has fired Dick and Archie for losing to Ali. Despite Doc's warning, George, after 6 months of solitude, aims to restore his reputation by taking on 5 opponents back-to-back. Ali is also there and still makes fun of George's new moves. His opponent tries to use the rope-a-dope, but this time, George shoves him off the ropes and easily knocks him out. Despite his victories, the crowd's all cheering for Ali, which really annoys him. He even challenges Ali to a match, but Ali casually turns him down. Later in the hospital, George's sister Mary is in labor. The doctors say the baby's in serious danger because it can't breathe right. Nancy believes praying is the only solution. George, who has never prayed before, starts talking to God and even offers his life instead of his niece's. The next morning, Nancy tells George his sister and her baby are okay. And George is amazed that his prayers actually worked last night. In 1977, George has a match against heavyweight Jimmy Young. Unfortunately, he's too hung up on his past loss to concentrate, and he ends up losing again. Back in the locker room, George is all worked up about losing. Suddenly, he hears this mysterious voice saying his name over and over, and he starts acting strangely before passing out. When he wakes up, George feels like God has given him a fresh start. At this point, he really does believe, and goes to the shower to cleanse himself, shouting, "Hallelujah!" This incident makes George completely change his beliefs and become a preacher. Now, all his anger's gone, and he's decided to earn respect with his heart, not his fists. He goes to Muhammad Ali, asking for forgiveness for his hatred, and also seeks forgiveness from his ex-wife. Even though Doc finds a way for him to rematch with Ali, George decides to retire from boxing. Doc thinks it's a big mistake and believes George still has a bright future in boxing, but George sticks to his decision. Over time, George starts preaching on the roadside and meets a religious woman named Mary Joan Martelli. Furthermore, he decides to buy an old church and renovate it. 7 years later, George, now married to Mary with 2 kids, becomes a pastor at his church. Unlike before, he's fully settled into family life and is happy. One day, a mom asks him to teach her son how to box, but he declines, believing the Bible holds all the answers. The next week, he learns the same kid got caught stealing. It reminds him of his troubled past. So he decides to start a sports center for street kids. With Desmond's help, they find a building, buy it, and gather everything needed to open the center. George even names parts of his youth center after Muhammad Ali. After a year, the place faces some troubles. The electricity suddenly shuts off, and Desmond is missing. Shockingly, it's discovered they never paid the electricity bill. George rushes to the bank and discovers he's broke with hefty debts because his money was used up and Desmond's stocks crashed. George has never been more enraged since his conversion. In frustration, he confronts Desmond at a bar, who admits their money vanished due to a fraudulent investment. George tries to make money by modeling for ads and selling merch, but it's not enough to clear his bank debts. The bank seizes his sports center, leaving him devastated. George begins to think clearly. He blames himself for losing his money, not Desmond. George had trusted him in spite of all his troubles. To pay off debts, he considers returning to boxing, but Mary fears his anger issues might resurface. George immediately goes to Doc and asks him to start all over again. The hurdles they face are George's age, and more importantly, his weight. Despite Doc's reluctance, he says George should come back when he hits 265 pounds. After years of eating, sleeping, and of course preaching, George needs to shake things up again. He embarks on a diet and workout plan with Mary's support in managing his food intake. He also uses his advanced modern methods to lose weight, like carrying animals on his shoulders or pulling cars. After shedding weight in months, George steps back into the ring noticeably slower and breathless, indicating decreased stamina. Nevertheless, he keeps training for 2 more years. Then in 1987, he's back in professional boxing after a decade. His opponent is a seasoned fighter. Doc offers George to unleash his former anger once again, but that's not what he wants. This time he takes his strange moral religious approach. He smiles in his opponent's face, aiming to win without causing harm. Even though he used to finish every fight by knockout, this time he secures his victory by a technical knockout and earns back his professional boxing status. The news of George's victory goes viral. He manages to win 18 matches without losing a single one, a comeback the boxing world hardly ever witnesses. Fast forward to 91, and he steps into the ring with Evander Holyfield in a heavyweight championship match. Both fighters land heavy punches, but after 7 rounds, Holyfield takes the win, holding on to his title. George may have lost the belt, but the cash he made keeps his sports center running. He could retire comfortably, but he's determined to be the world heavyweight champion once more. 3 years later, in 1994, the 45-year-old George steps into the ring against a new champ, Michael Moore. This Moore guy's like a younger version of Foreman, knocking out opponents left and right, including Holyfield, who took down Foreman 3 years ago. During the fight, George is struggling against Moore, and it seems like he's a target practice for the latter. Moore's got him staggering, and it looks like George ain't got much of a shot. During the 9th round break, when everyone is starting to lose hope, George doesn't show a hint of anger or disappointment. Instead, he signals to Doc that he's using his smarts. In the 10th round, George waits for the perfect moment and delivers a knockout punch, turning the tables on the young champ and making him the old one. George is the oldest heavyweight champ in the world. Amidst the loud crowd cheers, George takes a moment to thank God. As we can see at the end, George and Ali finally became close friends. Plus, Doc got honored in the Boxing Hall of Fame in 1998. George still runs his church and youth center, which is all right. But get this, George named all 6 of his kids George. Imagine poor Mary trying to call one of them in a room full of Georges. All right, that's all for today. Thank you for watching and see you soon.